January 28, 1977. Buffalo, New York woke to cold sunlight and clear skies. Lake Erie stretched to the horizon, a vast sheet of wind-scoured ice. No snow covered its surface. The water beneath had frozen early that winter, locking the lake into a hard, glassy plain that extended for miles. The temperature hovered near 0 Fahrenheit. People scraped frost from windshields in driveways across the city. Engines turned over reluctantly, exhaust clouds hanging in the still air. It was Friday morning. Schools were open. Factories were running. Downtown office buildings filled with workers. The city moved at its normal winter pace. The wind was light, calm even. Weather forecasters had mentioned a system moving in from the west, but Buffalo knew lake-effect snow. The city averaged 94 inches per winter. Residents kept shovels by their doors and snow tires on their cars from November through March. Nobody was concerned about another winter storm. Along the waterfront, the ice on Lake Erie gleamed under the morning sun. The surface had been frozen since early December, an unusually early freeze that locked the lake solid before winter snow could accumulate on top of it. The result was miles of bare ice, smooth and exposed, with nothing to anchor it down. Meteorologists at the National Weather Service office noted the approaching low-pressure system. Standard procedure. They tracked its movement across the Great Lakes region, watched the pressure gradients, monitored wind speeds. The forecast called for snow and wind. Buffalo had seen it 1,000 times. What they didn't fully account for was the combination. An open fetch of frozen lake surface, wind speeds accelerating rapidly, and temperatures cold enough to keep ice crystals suspended in the air indefinitely. The conditions were aligning for something Buffalo hadn't experienced in modern memory. By mid-morning, the wind changed direction. It swung around from the southwest, picking up speed across the open expanse of Lake Erie. The sky began to pale, not with clouds but with something else, a whiteness that wasn't falling from above but rising from below. Factory workers at the Republic Steel plant near the waterfront noticed it first, a haze forming over the lake. At first it looked like fog, a low mist creeping inland, but it was moving too fast, and it wasn't gray. It was brilliant white. At 11:15 a.m. the wind gusted to 40 miles per hour. On the lake surface, ice crystals that had formed over weeks of subzero nights began to lift, first in small swirls, then in sheets, then in walls that rose 20 feet high and moved inland like an advancing army. At 11:30 a.m., the first gusts hit the city. They weren't carrying fresh snow from the clouds above. They were lifting the ice from the lake surface itself, millions of tiny crystals that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The wind tore them loose and drove them inland like horizontal rainfall made of knives. Within minutes, the world disappeared. Drivers on the Kensington Expressway saw the wall approach, a rising curtain of white that moved across the lanes like something alive, something with intention. It consumed the landscape as it came. The opposite side of the highway vanished first, then the median. Then the car ahead. Brake lights flared red in the sudden darkness, then nothing. Visibility dropped from a quarter mile to less than the length of a car in under 30 seconds. Drivers hit their brakes instinctively. Cars collided in slow motion, metal meeting metal in the white void. Engines stalled. People sat in their vehicles, hands on steering wheels, unable to see their own dashboards clearly. On Main Street downtown, pedestrians caught between buildings froze in place. The wind hit with physical force, pushing people backward, tearing hats from heads, filling mouths and noses with ice crystals that stung like wasps. Those who tried to continue forward found themselves walking blind, hands outstretched, feeling for walls they knew should be there but couldn't see. The storm had arrived, but it wasn't a blizzard in the traditional sense. Not a single snowflake was falling from the sky. The clouds above were thin, barely present. Every particle in the air was being recycled, lifted from the ground and the lake, blown, packed, and driven by wind that was accelerating toward hurricane force. Store owners stood in doorways, watching their streets vanish. Traffic lights continued their cycles, red, yellow, green, but nobody could see them. The light itself seemed to be absorbed by the white, swallowed into a void that had no depth and no dimension. By noon, Buffalo had vanished beneath a river of ice that flowed through its streets like a flood made of frozen air. The city was still there, buildings and homes and people, but it had become invisible to itself, every person isolated in their own small sphere of white noise and stinging cold. The temperature held at zero. The wind continued to rise, and the storm, which had arrived without warning, showed no sign of stopping. What struck Buffalo on January 28, 1977 was not a snowstorm. It was a ground blizzard, a meteorological phenomenon that requires no precipitation at all. The snow was already there, on the lake, on the ground, in the fields outside the city, waiting to be weaponized by wind. Wind gusts reached 75 miles per hour in the city. On the open lake, they exceeded 80. At the Buffalo airport, instruments recorded sustained winds of 46 miles per hour with gusts to 69 before the sensors failed. These winds lifted ice crystals weighing almost nothing individually but devastating in aggregate. Each gust carried millions of them, sharp-edged and fine as sand, moving at highway speed. The National Weather Service would later calculate that visibility dropped below 5 feet in the worst moments. People standing on their own front porches could not see their mailboxes. Cars became invisible 10 feet away. Street signs vanished. Buildings disappeared. The city had been erased not by falling snow but by its own winter being thrown back into the air. The temperature was 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill pushed it to -60. Exposed skin froze in less than a minute. Breathing the wind felt like inhaling knives. Ice crystals penetrated clothing, worked through gaps in coats and scarves, found skin and froze to it. Buffalo's infrastructure had been designed for heavy snow, not this. The city owned hundreds of plows. Salt stockpiles measured in thousands of tons. Snow removal was a science Buffalo had perfected over decades. But you cannot plow wind. You cannot salt air. The storm was not depositing snow in predictable layers that could be cleared. It was sculpting drifts in minutes that would have taken hours to form in a normal blizzard, drifts built with terrifying speed. The wind compressed snow into densities that approached solid ice. The process was simple. Wind-driven snow particles collided at high speed, broke into smaller fragments, and packed together under pressure. The result was not the soft powder of a typical snowfall, but a concrete-like mass that could support a person's weight. Some drifts reached 15 feet in the first hour. By afternoon, they were blocking first-floor windows. By evening, they were covering roofs, and they formed in patterns that made no sense to human eyes. Streets running north-south filled completely while parallel streets a block away remained relatively clear. Corners became mountains. Open parking lots developed waves and ridges like sand dunes in a desert. The Kensington Expressway, one of Buffalo's main arteries, filled completely. Not with a layer of snow that could be cleared, but with a solid mass that buried cars to their roofs. Some vehicles were covered so quickly their drivers didn't have time to escape. They sat in darkness, engines running, carbon monoxide building in sealed spaces, waiting for help that couldn't reach them. Power lines snapped under the pressure of wind and ice. The lines themselves weren't heavily loaded with snow. The problem was the wind force and the ice crystals abrading the cables like sandpaper. By 2 p.m., entire neighborhoods went dark. Telephone lines followed. Transformers exploded in flashes of green light that nobody saw through the white. The city was being erased from the grid block by block as the storm isolated homes and trapped families in the cold and the growing dark. Electric heat stopped. Gas furnaces with electric ignition systems stopped. Refrigerators went silent. Lights went out. Buffalo was returning to a pre-industrial state, one circuit at a time. Emergency services began to fail. Ambulances couldn't respond to calls. Fire trucks couldn't reach fires. Police cruisers stopped where they stood. The 911 system, only 5 years old in Buffalo, became overwhelmed. Operators took calls from people trapped in cars, people trapped in homes without heat, people having heart attacks and strokes and accidents with no way to get help. Hospitals prepared for the worst. Buffalo General Hospital had a full emergency room when the storm hit. Patients kept arriving for the first hour, brought by family members or ambulances that barely made it through. Then the arrivals stopped. The doors stopped opening. The hospital was cut off, an island in white with whatever staff and supplies happened to be inside when the city disappeared. No new snow fell that day. Weather stations confirmed it. Precipitation was minimal. The storm lasted 36 hours and moved only what was already there. It was a blizzard made entirely of recycled winter, and Buffalo was defenseless against it. The wind speed was the critical factor. Below 30 miles per hour, snow stays on the ground. Between 30 and 40, it begins to drift. Above 40, it becomes airborne in quantities that block vision. Above 60, it becomes a weapon. Buffalo was experiencing winds in the hurricane range, sustained for hours, with an unlimited supply of ammunition from the frozen lake. By nightfall, the city had been under whiteout conditions for 7 hours. The wind hadn't decreased. The visibility hadn't improved. Buffalo was locked in a white prison that showed no sign of releasing it. Buffalo police officer Gary Smith was on patrol when the storm hit. His cruiser was eastbound on Genesee Street, routine patrol on a Friday morning when visibility collapsed. He radioed dispatch, reporting whiteout conditions, then lost visual contact with the road. Within 30 seconds, he couldn't see the hood of his own car. Smith stopped. He knew better than to continue blind. What he didn't know was that hundreds of other drivers were making the same decision at the same moment all across Buffalo. Cars stopped where they stood. Engines idled. Drivers waited. The wind screamed. Smith later told a local television reporter that it sounded like a freight train passing 3 feet from his window, continuous and deafening. The car rocked on its suspension. Metal groaned. Snow packed against the driver's side door with such force he couldn't push it open. He tried the passenger side. Same result. Within 10 minutes, drifts had locked both doors shut. The temperature inside the car began to drop. Smith kept the engine running, watching the fuel gauge, rationing what he had, aware that he might be stranded for hours. He radioed again. Dispatch acknowledged but could offer no help. Every unit was stranded. Every plow was buried. The entire city had stopped moving simultaneously. Outside, the world had turned black at midday. The density of blowing ice blocked the sun completely. Smith clicked on his spotlight and pointed it forward. The beam penetrated less than a meter before dissolving into white static. He tried the high beams. No difference. Light didn't work in this. It had nothing to reflect from except infinite particles of ice. He sat in darkness, feeling the car rock with each gust, hearing the metallic hiss of ice against metal like sand against glass. Snow began entering through microscopic gaps around the door seals, forming small drifts on the dashboard. He brushed them away with his glove. They reformed within minutes. Hours passed. The radio crackled with reports of similar situations across the city. Buses trapped with passengers inside. Ambulances unable to respond to calls. Snowplows abandoned after their blades broke against compressed drifts. Officers stranded in their cruisers, just like him, scattered across Buffalo in vehicles that had become stationary shelters. Smith stayed in the cruiser for 11 hours. The fuel gauge dropped slowly. He turned off the engine periodically to conserve gas, let the temperature inside drop to uncomfortable levels, then restarted it. His breath froze on the inside of the windows. His fingers went numb even inside his gloves. He thought about abandoning the car, trying to walk to shelter, but he couldn't see anything outside and had no idea which direction would lead to safety. When the wind finally dropped enough for visibility to return, it was after 10 at night. Smith opened the door into a landscape he didn't recognize. Genesee Street had disappeared beneath smooth, unbroken whiteness. Cars were visible only as slight mounds, shapes that might have been boulders or buildings or nothing at all. Streetlights protruded at odd angles, half buried. The drift against his car was over 8 feet high. He climbed out onto the roof of the cruiser and looked around. Buffalo was gone. In its place was an Arctic plain, silent and empty and utterly foreign. The city he'd patrolled for 6 years had been replaced by something from another world. Across the city, similar scenes played out in thousands of variations. Louise Hartman, a nurse at Sisters of Charity Hospital, had left for work at 6 a.m. before the storm hit. She made it to the hospital just as visibility collapsed. Her shift was supposed to end at 3 p.m. She stayed for 4 days. The hospital couldn't release staff who had nowhere to go. Roads were impassable. Homes were unreachable. The building became a shelter for its own workers. Hartman later described the view from the hospital windows. The parking lot disappeared first, cars vanishing under rising drifts. Then the streetlights went out. Then the buildings across the street became ghosts, barely visible through the white. By afternoon, the hospital was alone in the void, an island of light in darkness, surrounded by something that looked more like Arctic sea ice than a city in western New York. Inside, the staff worked without rest. Patients kept arriving in the first few hours, brought by family members who'd made desperate runs through the storm. Cardiac cases, accident victims, hypothermia. Then the doors stopped opening. The ambulances couldn't get through. The hospital had to work with whoever was inside and whatever supplies were on hand. Ron Colucci, a snowplow driver for the city, had been on duty since early morning. He was clearing Broadway when the storm hit. His plow was designed to move snow, built for exactly this kind of work. It was useless. The drifts formed faster than he could clear them. The blade hit compressed snow and bounced back, the impact traveling up through the hydraulics and into his hands on the steering wheel. He pushed through one drift, turned around, and found the street he just cleared was already filled again. The wind was moving snow back into place as fast as he could remove it. After an hour, he gave up. The plow sat where he stopped it, on a side street off Delaware Avenue, buried to its cab within 2 hours. Colucci abandoned the machine and walked to a nearby house. He knocked on the door. A family let him in. He stayed with them for 2 days, a stranger sleeping on their couch, eating their food, waiting for the white to clear. It was happening all over Buffalo. People took in strangers. Neighbors who'd never spoken shared heat and shelter. The storm had erased the normal boundaries between people. At least one family described the sound of the wind as worse than the cold or the visibility. It was constant howling, a frequency that got inside your head and stayed there. Windows rattled in their frames. Doors vibrated. Snow found gaps around windowsills and appeared inside houses, small drifts forming on carpets and furniture. People stuffed towels around windows and doors, but the ice was so fine it penetrated anyway. Michael Klein, a resident of North Buffalo, was interviewed by WKBW television days later. He described standing in his living room on Friday afternoon, watching the street outside vanish. He could see his neighbor's house across the street when the storm started. Within minutes, he couldn't. Within an hour, he couldn't see his own front yard. The mailbox 10 feet from his porch became invisible. The power went out at 2:30 p.m. Klein's house went dark and cold. He had a fireplace. He burned furniture to stay warm. Chairs first, then a bookshelf, then pieces of the dining room table. His family huddled in one room, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, watching the fire and listening to the wind. He tried to open the front door once, hours into the storm, just to see outside. The door wouldn't move. Snow had packed against it with such force the latch couldn't turn. He tried the back door. Same result. He was sealed inside his own house by pressure from the wind-driven snow. Klein and his family stayed inside for 3 days. They rationed food. They melted snow for water. They slept in shifts near the fireplace. When they finally opened the door on Sunday, the drift against the house was higher than the doorframe. They had to dig their way out of their own home. By evening on January 28, the Kensington Expressway looked like a white canyon. Drifts had piled 30 feet high in places, swallowing cars whole. Highway markers disappeared beneath the surface. Exit ramps filled level with the surrounding drifts, erasing the distinction between road and land. The expressway, designed to move thousands of vehicles per hour through Buffalo, had become an impassable snow field. Emergency crews attempting to reach stranded motorists found themselves stranded as well. Fire trucks made it 2 blocks before stopping. Ambulances with 4-wheel drive couldn't penetrate drifts that had solidified into barriers harder than packed earth. Tow trucks sent to retrieve abandoned vehicles became vehicles that needed retrieving themselves. City buses stopped where they stood, trapped mid-route with passengers huddled inside for warmth. Drivers kept engines running until fuel ran out. Some buses were buried so completely that rescuers searching the next day walked over them without realizing vehicles were underneath. The Buffalo Transit Authority would later report 36 buses abandoned in place, scattered across the city like toys dropped in snow. One bus on Main Street sat with 17 passengers inside for 19 hours. The driver, Thomas Reed, kept the engine running as long as possible. When the fuel tank ran dry, the temperature inside began to drop. Passengers shared coats. They wrapped themselves in floor mats. They used newspapers as insulation. Reed later told reporters that the hardest part wasn't the cold or the fear. It was having nothing to do except wait and watch people's breath turn to frost in the air. Power failures spread across the city in waves. 40,000 homes went dark in the first 3 hours. By midnight, the number exceeded 100,000. Utility crews couldn't reach the down lines. Trucks couldn't move. Repair workers couldn't see to work. Buffalo was going cold and dark in stages, neighborhood by neighborhood, as the storm severed connections to the outside world. Niagara-Mohawk Power Corporation, the regional utility, had crews ready. They had emergency protocols. They had backup systems. None of it mattered. Crew trucks couldn't drive. Linemen couldn't climb poles in 70-mile-per-hour wind. Repairs that normally took an hour took days, and every hour more lines came down. The telephone system collapsed as lines snapped under the weight of ice-laden wind. The weight wasn't from accumulation. It was from the physical force of wind driving ice particles against cables at hurricane speed. The lines abraded, weakened, and broke. The few lines that remained operational were overwhelmed with emergency calls. Families trapped in homes without heat. Elderly residents alone in the cold. Medical emergencies with no way to get help. Operators at the phone company worked double shifts, triple shifts, taking calls from people they couldn't help. What do you tell someone calling to report their heat is out, and they're trapped with an infant in a house getting colder by the hour? What do you tell someone having chest pains when you know no ambulance can reach them? The city's snow removal equipment proved useless. Plow blades, designed to push snow aside, shattered against drifts compressed by 75-mile-per-hour winds. The snow had the density of packed ice, hard enough to break steel. Operators abandoned machines where they stopped, walking away from plows that cost $50,000 because staying with them meant freezing. Buffalo owned 180 snowplows. By Saturday morning, fewer than 20 were still operational. Some had broken blades. Some had thrown hydraulics. Some were simply buried. The rest were trapped in garages that crews couldn't reach because the roads to the maintenance yards were impassable. Salt trucks fared no better. Rock salt works by lowering the freezing point of water, turning ice back into liquid. But the storm wasn't creating ice that could be melted. It was creating compressed drifts that had no liquid state to return to. Spreading salt on these drifts was like spreading salt on concrete. Nothing happened. Front-end loaders, normally used to pile snow in large lots, couldn't lift the compressed drifts. The buckets broke. Hydraulic lines burst. Engines overheated trying to move masses that weighed tons. Equipment designed for the worst Buffalo winters was inadequate for what the city faced. At the Buffalo Water Treatment Plant, workers realized they were trapped inside. The facility was designed to operate with minimal staffing, but someone had to be present. 4 employees who'd been on duty when the storm hit stayed for 3 days, sleeping on cots in the break room, keeping the city's water supply running while Buffalo died around them. Natural gas service continued, but it didn't matter for many homes. Modern furnaces required electricity for ignition systems and blowers. Without power, the gas couldn't burn. Houses with pilot lights stayed warm. Houses with electronic ignition went cold. The difference was arbitrary, a matter of when your furnace was manufactured, and it determined whether you had heat or not. Carbon monoxide poisoning began to claim victims. People without heat brought charcoal grills indoors. They ran car engines in garages with doors closed. They used gas stoves and ovens for warmth. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and deadly. Buffalo hospitals would later report treating dozens of poisoning cases and several deaths, all from people trying to stay warm during the storm. Fire departments received calls they couldn't answer. A house fire on Best Street burned for 6 hours because trucks couldn't reach it. The family escaped, but the structure burned to the foundation. Firefighters stood 2 blocks away, watching flames light up the White, unable to move closer through drifts that were higher than their trucks. Another fire on Fillmore Avenue spread to 3 houses before crews arrived. They walked to it, carrying hoses and equipment, dragging lines through chest-deep snow. By the time they had water on the fire, 2 of the houses were fully involved. They saved the third. Buffalo's medical infrastructure began to fracture. Hospitals had patients but no way to get more staff. Doctors and nurses trapped at home couldn't reach the buildings. Doctors and nurses trapped at hospitals couldn't leave. Some medical personnel walked miles through the storm to reach their posts, following railroad tracks because they were the only clear landmarks, arriving exhausted and frostbitten but ready to work. Dialysis patients missed treatments. Diabetics ran out of insulin. People with chronic conditions couldn't reach their doctors. The storm wasn't just a weather event. It was a medical crisis in slow motion, with effects that would continue long after the wind stopped. Grocery stores closed, those few that had managed to stay open. Shelves were empty anyway. Supply trucks hadn't arrived. Employees couldn't get to work. Stores that tried to stay open found they had no customers, nobody could reach them. Buffalo's food supply chain had stopped flowing. The city was suffocating under the White, not from lack of air but from lack of movement. Everything that required motion had stopped. Traffic, commerce, emergency services, communication. Buffalo had become a collection of isolated islands, each home and building cut off from every other, each person trapped in their own small space, waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. By Saturday morning, the storm was 30 hours old. The wind hadn't stopped. The visibility hadn't cleared. Buffalo had been erased from the map, replaced by something that didn't have a name in the normal vocabulary of American cities. Saturday, January 29, 1977. The storm's second day. The wind continued, gusting to 60 miles per hour, never dropping below 40. The sun rose somewhere above the White, but Buffalo remained in perpetual twilight. Light came from everywhere and nowhere. The air itself glowed with diffused brightness that cast no shadows and provided no sense of direction. People trapped in their homes lost track of time. Without power, clocks stopped. Without visibility, day and night blurred into a continuous gray-white existence. Families gathered in single rooms to conserve body heat. They wore layers, coats over sweaters over shirts, and still felt cold. Breath condensed in the air inside houses. Water froze in pipes. Toilets became unusable as supply lines burst. Food became a concern. Refrigerators had stopped working when the power failed, but in Buffalo in January, that didn't matter. The houses themselves were giant refrigerators now. People moved perishables to unheated rooms where they froze solid. Milk became cylinders of ice. Eggs froze in their shells. Families ate cold food from cans, or heated soup over candles, or cooked nothing at all. Some homes had gas stoves that still worked. These became gathering places. Neighbors who could navigate between houses came to share heat and food. A single working stove might serve 3 or 4 families. People brought what they had, pooled resources, and ate together in kitchens lit by candlelight while the storm raged outside. Water was another problem. With pipes frozen or broken, taps ran dry. People melted snow in pots on stoves or fireplaces. The snow had to be compacted. A pot full of fresh snow melted down to less than an inch of water. It took hours to melt enough for drinking, cooking, and basic washing. Some people went days without bathing. Hygiene became a luxury Buffalo couldn't afford. Children didn't understand. Too young to grasp the danger, they saw the drifts as adventure. Parents tried to explain they couldn't go outside. They couldn't see to play. The cold would freeze them in minutes. Some families tied ropes from their doors to nearby trees or fences, just in case someone had to venture out. The rope was the only way to find your way back in zero visibility. Mental strain began to show. Adults snapped at each other over small things. Families in close quarters for 36 hours straight developed cabin fever. The sound of the wind was inescapable, a constant howling that frayed nerves and prevented sleep. People described feeling trapped not just by the snow but by the noise, imprisoned by sound as much as by white. Battery-powered radios became lifelines to the outside world. Families gathered around small transistor radios, listening to WBEN and WGR, the local stations that stayed on the air. Announcers read lists of closed businesses, canceled events, emergency instructions. They told people to stay inside, to conserve heat, to check on neighbors if possible. The voices from the radio were proof that Buffalo still existed somewhere beyond the white. News reports confirmed what people suspected. The entire city was paralyzed. The Buffalo Evening News couldn't deliver papers. The storm had stopped delivery trucks. Reporters were stranded at home or at the office. The few who made it to the newsroom wrote stories that might not be read for days. Mayor Stanley Makowski declared a state of emergency and requested help from New York State. Governor Hugh Carey responded, mobilizing the National Guard. But mobilizing and arriving were different things. Guard units were as trapped as everyone else. Armored personnel carriers and military trucks sat in motor pools across western New York, ready to deploy but unable to move through drifts that topped 12 feet on open roads. The New York State Thruway, a major interstate highway running through Buffalo, closed completely for the first time in its history. Not just impassable, but officially closed and barricaded. Crews gave up trying to keep it clear. The wind refilled it faster than plows could work. Tractor-trailers jackknifed across lanes, then disappeared under drifts. Cars abandoned by desperate drivers became hazards buried under smooth white surfaces. Interstate 90 looked like a frozen parking lot. Vehicles sat where they'd stopped, scattered randomly across lanes. Some were empty, drivers having fled on foot toward shelter they couldn't see. Some were occupied, people still inside, waiting, hoping, growing colder. Some drivers died in their cars, engines running until fuel ran out, exhaust pipes plugged with snow, carbon monoxide filling sealed spaces. Search and rescue operations struggled to begin. The National Guard eventually moved units equipped with tracked vehicles, M113 armored personnel carriers and similar equipment, but even these made slow progress. Tracks provided traction, but they couldn't overcome drifts that were higher than the vehicles. Crews had to stop frequently to dig out tracks, a process that took hours in continuing wind. Guard personnel described the operation as surreal. Driving through Buffalo in military vehicles, they saw almost no one. The city looked abandoned. Streets were white and empty. No traffic lights were visible. Buildings were half buried. It looked like a city evacuated before some disaster, except the disaster was still happening and the people were still there, hidden behind walls and snow. When rescue crews reached occupied homes, they found families grateful but embarrassed. People apologized for needing help, as if being trapped by a historic blizzard was their fault. They offered what little they had, coffee melted from snow, cold sandwiches, to their rescuers. Buffalo's culture of self-reliance ran deep. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat. At the Buffalo Convention Center, city officials established an emergency shelter. The building had backup power and working heat. Cots were set up in meeting halls. The Red Cross organized food service, but getting people to the shelter proved nearly impossible. Those who needed it most, the elderly, the sick, those without heat, couldn't travel. Those who could travel often chose to stay home. The shelter housed several hundred people at its peak, most of them stranded travelers who'd been caught in the city when the storm hit. Salespeople on business trips. Truck drivers waiting for roads to clear. A few residents from neighborhoods where heat had failed completely. They slept on cots in large rooms lit by emergency lights, listening to the wind hammer the building's walls. Doctors and nurses staffed a medical station at the shelter, treating frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion. Volunteers from the city's churches and community organizations worked in shifts, serving food, distributing blankets, trying to keep morale up. The work was endless and thankless and necessary. Some people refused evacuation. When National Guard units reached homes and offered transport to shelters, residents said no. They didn't want to leave their houses unattended. They didn't want to abandon pets. They didn't trust that they'd be able to return. Buffalo's working-class neighborhoods had a culture of staying put and riding things out. The storm was just weather, more severe than usual, but still just weather. Suburban areas suffered worse than the city center. Towns like Amherst, Cheektowaga, and West Seneca had less infrastructure and fewer resources. Fire departments were volunteer operations. Police departments had minimal staff. When those towns went dark and silent, they had no one to call. Williamsville, a suburb east of Buffalo, reported drifts over 20 feet high. Main Street disappeared. The village center became a white plain with roofs protruding like small hills. Residents trapped in split-level houses on cul-de-sacs had no way to signal distress, no way to call for help. They waited in dark, cold houses, hoping someone would remember they were there. Nursing homes and elderly care facilities faced critical situations. Many had backup generators, but generators required fuel. Fuel trucks couldn't deliver. Generators ran dry, and buildings filled with vulnerable people went cold. Staff members who'd been trapped on duty when the storm hit stayed for days, caring for residents with dwindling supplies and no reinforcements. One nursing home in Cheektowaga lost power on Saturday afternoon. The generator failed 2 hours later. Staff wrapped residents in blankets and moved them to a single large room with a fireplace. They burned whatever wood they could find, furniture, fence posts, scraps from a storage shed, to keep the room barely above freezing. No one died, but it was close. By Saturday evening, Buffalo had been under blizzard conditions for more than 30 hours. The storm showed no sign of stopping. The wind had decreased slightly, but visibility remained near zero. The city was buried deeper every hour. And the worst part was the uncertainty. Nobody knew when it would end. Nobody knew how much longer they'd have to survive in the white. Radio announcers tried to stay positive, but the strain showed in their voices. They told people to stay calm, to conserve resources, to help neighbors. They gave updates on rescue operations and emergency services. They didn't talk about the deaths, not yet. That would come later when the counting could begin. The storm continued into Saturday night, the wind howling through darkness, the city invisible to itself, waiting for dawn that might not bring any change. Sunday, February 1, 1977. The wind died sometime before dawn. No dramatic ending, no sudden clearing. The gusts simply weakened, dropped below critical speed, and the ice crystals fell back to earth. Visibility returned in stages, first to a few dozen feet, then 100, then more. As the sun rose, Buffalo emerged from the white like a photograph developing in a darkroom. The city that appeared was unrecognizable. Genesee Street had become a canyon of snow. Drifts rose 20 feet high in some places, smooth and sculpted by 3 days of hurricane-force wind. Cars were buried completely, visible only as slight depressions or the tips of antennas protruding from otherwise smooth surfaces. Parking meters stuck up at odd angles like fence posts in a field. The Kensington Expressway was invisible. The highway had filled completely, a white riverbed cutting through Buffalo with no indication that a road had ever existed beneath. Guardrails disappeared. Signs marking exits were buried. The expressway had become a white plain that stretched for miles, continuous and featureless. Residential streets were worse. In neighborhood after neighborhood, drifts had piled against houses to the rooflines. Some homes were completely buried on one side, the wind-driven snow forming masses that covered first-floor windows, second-floor windows, and kept going to the eaves. Others stood strangely exposed, the wind having scoured around them, carving bowls and ridges that followed no pattern humans would recognize. Downtown, the office towers stood like islands in an ocean of white. Drifts had settled in the canyons between buildings, leveling the spaces to a depth of 10 or 15 feet. Main Street was a silent corridor with vertical snow walls where storefronts once framed the sidewalks. Traffic lights hung above nothing, their housings packed with ice. The silence was profound. No traffic, no voices, no machinery. A city of nearly 500,000 stood still, holding its breath beneath the weight of the storm. The only sound was the faint, shifting whisper of wind moving across the sculpted surface of the snow. By mid-morning, residents began emerging from their homes, some through doors, others through second-story windows, still others tunneling out with shovels and makeshift tools. Neighbors called out to one another across the drifts, voices carrying farther than normal in the cold, dense air. Emergency crews advanced street by street, often on foot, probing drifts for buried cars or stranded residents. National Guard vehicles moved slowly through the city, their high clearance allowing them to travel where no other machine could. Helicopters circled low, scanning rooftops and frozen roads for signs of movement. The scale of the disaster grew clearer with every passing hour. Thousands were trapped. Entire districts remained inaccessible. Supplies had to be airlifted. Schools and businesses would stay closed for days, some for weeks. Buffalo had endured storms before, but nothing like this, nothing that so completely erased the familiar outlines of the city. And yet, as the light strengthened and more people appeared, the tone shifted. The storm had taken lives, reshaped landscapes, and revealed the fragility of a major American city, but it had not broken it. Buffalonians dug pathways between houses, shared food, checked on elderly neighbors, and helped clear entrances to shelters and hospitals. By late afternoon, long shadows stretched across the drifts. The city was still buried, still stunned, still struggling, but alive. The blizzard had swallowed Buffalo, but as February 1 unfolded, the city began the slow, determined work of returning from the white silence.